Calling Card by Ramsey Campbell. Read by Carr. Dorothy Harris stepped off the pavement and into her hall. As she stooped, groaning to pick up the envelopes, the front door opened a yawn that wouldn't be suppressed. She wrestled it shut. She must ask Simon to see to it, though certainly not over Christmas. Then she began to open the cards. Here was Father Christmas, and here he was again, apparently after dieting. Here was a robin like a rosy apple with a beak. And here was an envelope whose handwriting staggered. Simon and Marjorie's children, perhaps. The card showed a church on a snowy hill. The hill was bare, except for a smudge of ink. Though the card was unsigned, there was writing within. A very happy Christmas and a prosperous new year, the message should have read. But now it said, a very harried Christmas and no new year. She turned back to the picture, her hands shaking. It wasn't just a smudge of ink. Someone had drawn a smeary cross on the hill. A grave. Though the name on the envelope was a watery blur, the address was certainly hers. Suddenly the house, the kitchen and living room, the two bedrooms with their memories stacked neatly against the walls, seemed far too large and dim. Without moving from the front door, she phoned Marjorie. "Is that Grandma?" Marjorie had to hush the children while she said, "You come as soon as you like, Mummy." Lark Lane was deserted. An unsold Christmas tree loitered in a shop doorway. A gargoyle craned out from the police station. Once Marjorie had moved away, the nearness of the police had been reassuring. Not that Dorothy was nervous, like some of the old folk these days, but the police station was only a community centre now. The bus already sounded like a pub. She sat outside on the ferry, though the bench looked and felt like black ice. Lights fished in the Mersey. Gulls drifted down like snowflakes from the muddy sky. A whitish object grabbed the rail, but of course it was only a gull. Nevertheless, she was glad that Simon was waiting with the car at Woodside. As soon as the children had been packed off to bed so that Father Christmas could get to work, she produced the card. It felt wet, almost slimy, though it hadn't before. Simon pointed out what she had overlooked, the age of the stamp. "We weren't even living there then," Marjorie said. "You wouldn't think they would have bothered delivering it after 60 years. A touch of the Christmas spirit. "I wish they hadn't bothered," Marjorie said. But her mother didn't mind now. The addressee must have died years ago. She turned the conversation to old times, to Marjorie's father. Later she gazed from her bedroom window at the houses of Bebbington sleeping in pairs. A man was creeping about the house, but it was only Simon, laden with presents. In the morning, the house was full of cries of delight, gleaming new toys, bowls of wrapping paper big as cabbages. In the afternoon, the adults, bulging with turkey and pudding, lolled in chairs. When Simon drove her home that night, Dorothy noticed that the unsold Christmas tree was still there, a scrawny, glistening shape at the back of the shop doorway. As soon as Simon left, she found herself thinking about the unpleasant card. She tore it up, and then went determinedly to bed. Boxing Day was her busiest time, what with cooking the second version of Christmas dinner and making sure the house was impeccable, and hiding small presents for the children to find. She wished she could see them more often, but they and their parents had their own lives to lead. An insect clung to a tinsel globe on the tree. When she reached out to squash the insect, it wasn't there, neither on the globe nor on the floor. Could it have been the reflection of someone thin outside the window? Nobody was there now. She liked the house best when it was full of laughter, and it would be again soon.
"We'll get a sitter," Marjorie promised, "and first foot you on New Year's Eve." She used to do that when she had lived at home. She'd waited outside at midnight of the old year so as to be the first to cross her mother's threshold. That reminded Dorothy to offer the children a holiday treat. Everything seemed fine, even when they went to the door to leave.
"Grandma, someone's left you a present,"
little Denise cried. Then she cried out and dropped the package. Perhaps the wind had snatched it from her hands. As the package, which looked wet and mouldy, struck the curb, it broke open. Did its contents scuttle out and sidle away into the dark? Surely that was the play of the wind, which tumbled carton and wrapping away down the street. Someone must have used the doorway for a waste bin, that was all. Dorothy lay in bed, listening to the wind which groped around the windowless side of the house that faced onto the alley. She kept thinking she was on the ferry, backing away from the rail, forgetting that the rail was also behind her. Her nervousness annoyed her. She was acting like an old fogey, which was why next afternoon she walked to Otterspool Promenade. Gulls and planes sailed over the Mersey, which was deserted except for boys. On the far bank, tiny towns and stalks of factory chimneys stood at the foot of an enormous frieze of clouds. Sunlight slipped through to Birkenhead and Wolsey, touching up the colours of microscopic streets. Specks of windows glinted. She enjoyed none of this, for the slopping of water beneath the promenade seemed to be pacing her. Worse, she couldn't make herself go to the rail to prove that there was nothing. Really, it was heartbreaking. One vicious card and she felt nervous in her own house. A blurred voice seemed to creep behind the carols on the radio, lowing out of tune. Next day she took the washing to Lark Lane in search of distraction as much as anything. The Westinghouse laundromat was deserted. "Oh, oh, oh," the washing machine said emptily. There was only herself and her dervishes of clothes, and a black plastic bag almost as tall as she was. If someone had abandoned it, whatever its lumpy contents were, she could see why, for it was leaking. She smelled stagnant water. It must be a draft that made it twitch feebly. Nevertheless, if she'd been able to turn off her machine, she might have fled. She mustn't grow neurotic. She still had friends to visit. The following day, she went to a friend whose flat overlooked Wavertree Park. It was all very convivial. A rainstorm outside made the mince pies more warming. The chat flowed as easily as the whiskey. but she kept glancing at the thin figure who stood in the park, unmoved by the downpour. The trails of rain on the window must be lending him their color, for his skin looked like a snail's. Eventually, the 68 bus, meandering like a drunkard's monologue, took her home to Edgeborough. No, the man in the park hadn't really looked as though his clothes and his body had merged into a single greyish mass. Tomorrow she was taking the children for their treat, and that would clear her mind. She took them to the aquarium. Piranhas sank stonily, their sides glittering like Christmas cards. Toads were bubbling lumps of tar. Finny humbugs swam, and darting fish wired with light. Had one of the tanks cracked? There seemed to be a stagnant smell. In the museum, everything was under glass. Shrunken heads like sewn leathery handbags, a watchmaker's workshop, buses passing as though the windows were silent films. Here was a slum street, walled in by photographs of despair. Real flagstones underfoot, overhung by street lamps on brackets. She halted between a grid and a drinking fountain. She was trapped in the dimness between blind corners and couldn't see either way. Why couldn't she get rid of the stagnant smell? Grey, forlorn faces, pressed like specimens, peered out of the walls.
"Come on quickly,"
she said, pretending that only the children were nervous. She was glad of the packed crowds in Church Street, even though the children kept letting go of her hands. But the stagnant smell was trailing her, and once, when she grabbed for little Denise's hand, she clutched someone else's, which felt soft and wet. It must have been nervousness which made her fingers seem to sink into the hand. That night, she returned to the aquarium and found that she was locked in. Except for the glow of the tanks, the narrow room was oppressively dark. In the nearest tank, a large, dead fish floated towards her out of the weeds. Now, she was in the tank, her nails scrabbling at the glass, and she saw that it wasn't a fish, but a snail-coloured hand which closed spongily on hers. When she woke, her scream made the house sound very empty. At least it was New Year's Eve. After tonight she could stop worrying. Why had she thought that? It only made her more nervous. Even when Marjorie phoned to confirm they would first foot her, that reminded her how many hours she would be on her own. As the night seeped into the house, the emptiness grew. A knock at the front door made her start, but it was only the Harveys inviting her next door for sherry and sandwiches. While she dodged a sudden rainstorm, Mr. Harvey dragged at her front door, one hand through the letterbox until the latch clicked. After several sherries, Dorothy remembered something she'd once heard.
"The lady who lived next door before me, didn't she have trouble with her son? He wasn't right in the head. He'd got so he'd go for anyone, even if he'd never met them before. She got so scared of him, she locked him out one New Year's Eve. They say he threw himself in the river, though they never found the body."
Dorothy wished she hadn't asked. she thought of the body rotting in the depths. She must go home in case Simon and Marjorie arrived. The Harveys were next door if she needed them. The Sherrys had made her sleepy. Only the ticking of her clock, clipping away the seconds, kept her awake. 11:20. The splashing from the gutters sounded like wet footsteps pacing outside the window. She had never noticed she could smell the river in her house. She wished she had stayed longer with the Harveys. She would have been able to hear Simon's car. 11:20. Surely they wouldn't wait until midnight. She switched on the radio for company. A master of ceremonies was making people laugh. A man was laughing thickly, sounding waterlogged. Was he a drunk in the street? He wasn't on the radio. She mustn't brood. Why, she hadn't put out the sherry glasses. That was something to do, to distract her from the intolerably measured counting of the clock. The silenced radio, the emptiness displaying her sounds. Though the knock at the door seemed enormously loud, she didn't start. They were here at last, though she hadn't heard the car. It was New Year's Day. She ran, and she reached the front door when the phone shrilled. That startled her so badly that she snatched the door open before lifting the receiver. Nobody was outside, only a distant uproar of cheers and bells and horns, and Marjorie was on the phone.
"We're being held up, Mummy. There was an accident in the tunnel. We'll be over as soon as we can."
Then, who had knocked? It must have been a drunk. She'd heard him stumbling beside the house, thumping on her window. He'd better take himself off, or she would call Mr. Harvey to deal with him. But she was still inside the doorway when she saw the object on her step. Good God! Was it a rat? No, just a shoe, so ancient that it looked stuffed with mold. It wasn't mold, only a rotten old sock. There was something in the sock, something that smelled of stagnant water, and worse. She stooped to peer at it, and then she was struggling to close the door, fighting to make the latch click. No breath to spare for a scream. She'd had her first foot, and now, hobbling doggedly alongside the house, its hands slithering over the wall, here came the rest of the body. Production, sound design and editing by Brendan James. Please support the Black Dog Chronicles by liking this video, sharing on your favorite social media, and subscribing. As always, we thank you for listening. This is Hugh Carr.